Yes, yes, you're going away. All right. Let me know when you guys can see this. That's weird. Another one. All right. Yeah, just say something when you guys have the video feed. Um, I'll go ahead and pull some stuff up here. Yep. Awesome. Cool. So today, well, first off, I want to start before we dive into the component lifecycle. It's probably my fault for not following up with her, but I never did hear back from Daisy directly on whether she was able to get somebody else to do the in-person class on Thursday and Saturday this week. So let's just go with the assumption that she didn't do that. So we won't have in-person class on Thursday and Saturday. I'm still putting together some stuff for you guys to work on, / potentially a video tonight if I have time after I finish packing to get it done for you guys while I am out. But I'll definitely have some solid instructions for you guys to continue to work. So if you want to work collectively, you can feel free to do that. Obviously, unless somebody else has a key to the classroom, you wouldn't necessarily be able to get in there, but it might still be nice to get together and work together on the projects or other content that you will have. So I'll post that in Slack at the end of the class as well, but I just wanted to go ahead and get that announcement out at the start. And then I will be back next Tuesday, which of course will be remote. And then I think actually, fortunately, I'm out that following Saturday too. My wife moved around a vacation that we had to cancel earlier and ended up falling at that time. So I'll be out then. So figure out what we're going to do for what would be like the last class of the session that Saturday. Whether we try and shift the day a little bit or record something, we'll figure that out next week. Anyways, today we're going to be covering the component lifecycle. So this is really talking about what's happening inside of React components, sort of diving a little deeper into the internals of React, but also because when we're working with these newer components that we're working with, we need to be able to understand component lifecycle because it's an important aspect of working with them successfully. To get started though, let's just do a quick quiz, just some questions about React. Hopefully we can get some of this, or you guys have learned some of this so far. It gets a little harder as we go on, but let's start with, what are the two different types of components in React? So we've talked about two types of components. Functional, yep. And the other one we introduced in the last class very heavily, so. Yep. And functional components and class components. Those are the two different types of components. One important thing to be aware of with this is that this should only matter internal to the component part and internal to React. So you don't interact when you're writing your React code. You don't really interact with a functional versus class component in any different way. You treat them the same when you're composing something out of components, but they can work different under the covers. So the next one is, what does React call the data that is passed into a component? Props, that's right, yep. Props is what gets passed into each component. And that's distinct from What is the data that is managed internally by a component called? Exactly. Yep. State. State is anything that's managed internal to a component is called its state, and anything that gets passed into a component is called props. If you were to compare that to, say, a function or anything that we've written before, you could say that props are like the arguments to a function when you call a function, and state is it's not really a perfect comparison. State is closer to an actual class concept of of data, but it's a little bit like a variable that's just declared inside of a function. I say it's not a perfect relationship because state hangs around between renders. And does anybody remember what component method do you call to change a value in the component state? Yep, set state. Or set states, just to be pedantic, because it's a method on the object. But yeah, it's set state. And there's several different signatures to set state. If we were to look at that, you can see some of them. Oh, let me see here. Let's see if we look at like the, not advanced guide, API reference. I think it'll be down in here. Here we go. You can dig into this documentation and see these several different versions of set state. It's a little confusing to see them, but they do have some examples of each one of them, like the most basic version. And then you've got some of your more complex ones for when you're dealing with a more complex scenario. Hopefully there's no questions on that. I mean, the set state thing, we've only talked about it once in state, most of the class, but we didn't do as much talking about set state. So maybe not everyone got that, but it shouldn't be too hard. So let's just start talking a little bit about what's going on in this cycle for React component, right? This is really what we're going to be focusing on today. I'll talk about this, and then I'll write at least one React thing. It's really just stealing straight from their documentation for at least the first one that emphasizes what's going on with that life cycle. And if we get done with that pretty quickly, which is a possibility, then I might expand on that to show a little bit more of a composition of React components, as well as emphasizing some of that lifecycle work a little more. But to get started, important thing to note is for class components, when you're working with class components, React doesn't actually recreate the component when the state or the props change. If you're dealing with a functional component, React just calls the function again and gives you back whatever it would get. But with class components, it's very much like an object in another programming language. The object stays around, and instead what's going to happen when the props or the state change for the component is React is going to run it through what's known as the component update lifecycle. And there are 3 different lifecycles for a class-based component in React that together make up the whole lifecycle of it. Creating. You can think of this comparable to, if you've worked with objects, when we did previous stuff, when you new up an object, mounting and creating is pretty much newing up the object. Then the next one, and this is where a component spends most of its time in a React application, is usually you mount or create it once, and then most of its time is spent being updated. So if the props or the state changes, then that component's going to be in that updating state, and it's going to re-render itself. And then you've got this third state that we haven't had to worry about too much so far, but it's a really important one for building out large React applications where you're adding components and removing them and changing what's visible on the screen. And that's the unmounting or removing state of a component. So those 3 states together make up the life cycle of working with a React component. So let's dive into each one a little more. So during the mounting life cycle, this is when your component's being created. That's what happened. Oh yeah, occurs when a component is first. This it goes through is first it's going to call your constructor. We've already seen that. We've written constructor with some initialization code in it last class. We can, let me swing over here and we can look at that, right? We've got this constructor here that calls super and then sets some state. So that's the first thing that's going to happen when it's mounting or creating your component. It's going to call your constructor. The next thing it's going to do is it's going to call the render method of your component. So again, if we go back here and let's minimize this. So it calls the constructor, it's constructed your component, then it calls render, and it gets back whatever came from render, and that's your element that's going to be returned from your component. That's what actually gets composed when you're writing the JSX, like the app bit here, is what you get back from calling render. And then the last step of this is when it's come back from render, what's interesting about this, it's not really officially a step in the mounting lifecycle, is when render has been called, but it isn't actually on in the DOM yet. So React calls all these lifecycle methods, but it hasn't put that content into the DOM somewhere. It's got back what it needs, but until it's finished with all of these sort of renders and it's got what it needs for everything, it doesn't add it to the DOM. So sometimes you need to know, is this component in the DOM? So am I rendering in the DOM so I can do stuff related to that? And that's what this component did mount method is. This method gets called when that component is actually in your DOM, in your React structure. And we're going to see that in just a few minutes when we're sort of working through an example of building out a component that cares about these sort of lifecycle aspects. Is we're going to see that component did mount and when you want to use it and why. So the next portion, this is, like I said, this is where most of your component spends its time. Is it only gets rendered or created once, only go to mounting portion once unless you do something really weird. And most of the time, your component's in the updating lifecycle. So that's whenever a component gets new props, or set state is called to change the state, or there's another method on components called force update that you can call that forces the components to re-render as well. That's useful really if you're hooking into like an external framework maybe that can't communicate with React, and so you need to shim that in a little bit. And what happens during the updating lifecycle is, again, it will call render, because that render method of your component is the key to these first two steps. That's how you get what's actually going to end up on your page. And then it's going to call component did update. Component did update is the method attached that lets you know, oh, this component changed, something about it actually changed. And sometimes you need to hook into that as well. It's less common that you need to hook into component did update than some of the mounting or unmounting lifecycle hooks, but it's a critical one, especially when you're into party stuff. And then unmounting lifecycle. So this is happening when a component is actually being removed from the DOM. So I'll try and make sure, I think we're moving real fast through this first stuff. Let me know if it's going too fast and you want to review this a second time as well. But the unmounting lifecycle is one of those ones that you don't necessarily need to focus on as much, but it can be critical, especially, I should have some slides in here saying what you would want to do in some of these different steps of the life cycle, but there's different things that you might want to do in each one. Unmounting is if you have resources that you've set up for your component and they're laying around somewhere or something's going on, which I'll emphasize in the demo as well. That's when you want to make sure you delete those things so that they don't stay around after your component and don't keep taking up resources. So the unmounting lifecycle is you get component will unmount. This gets called right before it's removed from the DOM. so that you can do any of this cleanup stuff you need to do before it's out of the DOM. And then there's some other bits in these. I'm not focusing on those because those are much more rarely used. So these are like the core ones. And you can override each one of these lifecycle methods in a component to handle whatever needs you have, right? These all come from, if we were to, let's go back here and look, all of those lifecycle methods are defined on this React.component class. And so the Gizmo, can you be quiet? So React.component defines the constructor, the component will mount, the render, the component did update, the component will unmount. All of those methods exist on that. So when we call, that's why when we declare a constructor here, we have to also call down to the super, because we're overriding the constructor from React.component. And that's why we didn't have to put the constructor in it first, because if we didn't have one, React.component still had a constructor to do the work that we wanted. I sort of gave you a hint here, but we've already overridden 2 of these lifecycle methods in our class components. Which ones did we override already? Is he named Gizmo because he looks like a Mogwai? No. I don't know why he was named Gizmo. It's the name he had when we got him, and he responded to it. Yeah, we did. Times clicked was when we overrode one of these, but it's not necessarily one of the lifecycle methods I mentioned. So let's go back and look at these for a second. These are the lifecycle methods that we have. And which ones have we already overridden at some point in our code? There's the constructor method, render, component did mount. And if you're unsure about what I mean by overridden, basically I mean which one did we actually write code for? So we're overriding the base implementation that isn't ours. Which ones have we actually done that for? We also have render again, component did update, and so there's 2 of those that we've overridden so far. Yep, constructor and render, exactly. So one of these is actually required to be overridden in a class component. You always have to override one of these lifecycle methods. Which one is it? Do you know? Render, exactly. You always have to define a render method, right? We had examples of class components where we didn't have a constructor, but if you're writing a class component, you have to define a render method. Otherwise, there's nothing to actually render. It doesn't output anything. So this is a link. When you're trying to learn about the component lifecycle, how this stuff works, I think this is just a fantastic reference because it helps show you what's going on in it at this high level and show you a little bit about what happens and what triggers some of these, right? So if you were to look at, I think there's actually an interactive version of this. I don't know what's going on with this. Let me see. I thought there was an interactive version too. Maybe that is this one. It's just I'm not doing anything. So what happens is when your component mounts, it calls the constructor. Oh, I don't want to click to the documentation, which then ends up calling the render method, essentially, which is going to update the React DOMs and references. And once all that's done, it's going to fire component did mount. And whenever the props change for a component or set state inside of the component's called or force update is called, it's also going to call that same render method, which is going to update the DOMs and references and then call component did update. And then unmounting just has this component will unmount bit. It's not quite as quite as fancy. It's a lot cleaner, but it's important to be able to call that when common mounting. So before we dive into working an example with this, does anybody have a question about this life cycle stuff or anything you want to talk more about before we start working through an example of using some of this? All right. So one thing I will point out as well with pretty much, you'll notice that a lot of the work or a lot of the exercises I go through, work I'm talking about, a lot of it's coming straight from the React documentation in some way or another. And that's not just because I think it's really good, but it also means that if you want to get another perspective on some of this, if you want to be able to read about it in more depth, like instead of just listening to a video or something, you can go through this set of main concepts and you'll find that it's very, very similar to what I've been working through. And the descriptions are very similar. A lot of stuff's sort of been taken from it. So yeah, I can understand not being clear about the unmounting bit. I hope it'll make more sense in the example. It's a good question. When we kept track of our button clicks at the last class, we could have used did mount. Well, let's see what we have as life cycle again. Let me double check these. Well, not exactly. We couldn't use did mount because that should only happen once. And I'll emphasize that. I think you guys will see as we build this out what I'm talking about. Hopefully it'll make some more sense because I'll just write some extra code to help highlight some of this. There's some plugins and things that people have written to help visualize it a little bit too, but I hope it'll make sense as we work through an example. So the first example I wanted to work through of something a little more complex than we've had, but not too much, is just making a clock. This is pretty much the same thing that's in the React tutorial for this, and they've got a very basic aspect. Oh, that's an interesting question. So it was component did mount and component will unmount and component did update only operate on a back end, right? That's not true because React not really only runs on the front end, but React pretty much only runs on your front end in your browser. Now, those bits of code you want to be careful in those changing the UI. I get what's being said there. It was like none of those change the UI. Those are you need to be very, very cautious changing the UI in component did mount or component did update because you could easily end up in an infinite loop if that happens. Because if you do something that will trigger some sort of change in your component and component did update, then it's going to re-render, which will trigger component did update, which will probably trigger your change, which will cause you to re-render. And so you can easily put your code in a loop that just goes forever and can never exit. Component did mount. I don't know if I can easily show you a good example of where you would use it, but that's used a lot of times if you need information. Well, you'll only know about your component when it's rendered into the DOM. So an example of that might be if you want to get the height of your elements, you want to know how tall it is or how wide it is, and you didn't hard code those values, you let the DOM determine that information, then that's where you would use like component did mount because, oh, now that I'm in the DOM, I can measure my height, I can measure my width, etc. And then component will unmount is usually used for getting rid of other resources. And we'll emphasize like component did mount and will unmount in the code that I'm going to go through for the clock. And I might try and show you like the infinite loop problem that can happen with did update, just to show you sort of what goes on in there. So let me see what we have here. All right, I'm going to spin up a new Create React app, I think. Do I have a clock? I probably already have a clock here, but I'm going to try and spin up a new one. All right. And that way I can go back to this this other one that I made up with the button click counter, because I think I'm going to make that a little more complicated. What is considered as other resources? Well, I hope it'll make sense when we do the clock, but one of the things that we're going to do is we're going to do we're going to create an interval timer to fire every second. And so that's something that's like base JavaScript. So an example, like we don't even have to have a component to do something like that. So right here in just our JavaScript, we could write, let me show the console here. I can make this a little smaller probably. We could do a like set interval. Hold on to a reference to this, hold on. So when you set an interval, you tell it what to do every second or every time the interval fires, and then you tell it how long it is in milliseconds between intervals. So in this one, we're going to do something real simple. We're just going to do a console.log fired interval timer. So that's all we're doing, and I'll say that'll fire every second. And what we should see is every second, we're getting that message in the event log here or in the console. And that's something that's outside of, so for if you declared this in a component, and this is what we're going to be using as well, that when that component gets deleted, that interval won't necessarily get deleted. So you'd still have code there firing and causing an issue. And so when you want to get rid of an interval, you need to have held onto a reference to it. And then you can, wait a minute, is it clear? It's clear interval. And then you need to pass it the handle that you held on to. So you notice I returned a value from this set interval and held on to it. So now I've cleared it and it's not going to be firing every second anymore, right? That's an example of something that would be like another external resource to your component that you would need to manage, because that lifecycle or that interval stuff isn't really tied to a component anywhere. So let's see where we're at here. All right, we spun up a new Create React App project. So let's go into it. Lifecycle clock example. And I'm just going to change this over right now. Let's see. To open that project instead. There we go. Don't care. It's all going to be very simple, similar to what we've already had, right? Here's our app.js file, all of this React code. I don't care about any of this. Like before, I'm getting rid of that. I'm not going to care about this logo CSS thing or this app.css, although I'm going to come back and talk about this in another class. And then what we're going to want is inside of this app, we're going to want some sort of clock component. So let's just assume that I'm going to create a clock component. So I can just invoke it right here. Now, in this case, I'm going to go ahead and show you guys something a little different than the workflow that we've had. It's a minor change in terms of workflow, but it's important in the long run to be able to build stuff out this way. Again, if you're comfortable working in one file right now and just keeping all your components there, you don't need to follow this workflow that I'm going to show, but this is an example of how to split your stuff up, right? So I'm going to say, okay, well, I want a clock component, but I'm not going to put it in the same file this time. So I'm going to create a clock.js file where I'm going to define my clock component. And one of the first things I need to do, because this is going to create a component, is I need to import React. So that's importing that dependency. And then I'm going to create this class called clock that extends react.components. And I've got one thing that's a requirement, as we said, is render. You have to have a render method inside of your component. And you'll see it's even a little, it's complaining here. Our render method should have a return. So for now, I'm just going to return null, which is actually a valid value to return from a component. It's special in that it's like one of the only non-element, React element things you can return, but null qualifies as well. The only problem is, since this is in a separate file, I need to export it. And so I'm just going to export it as the default export from this. And then in my app.js, I can import this. And I usually like to keep my local imports, anything that came from a third party like React. So in this case, like app.css would be considered local. And then the other thing I want to import is clock.js. Oops, I'm missing the dot. And oh, this isn't quite the right syntax. I need to import clock from clock.js. So I'm telling it what to import and what to import it from. And now it's got a clock in here. Let me check and see this comment. Aren't we able to call component on the import? Oh, I see what you're saying, I think. You are, yes. You could do import react.component from React, or if you want, you could say import. You would do it this way because component is just a portion of that whole thing. So you could say import component from React. That's also valid because when you, I don't want to get into too much around that, but doing it right now is just using the default component export, just like this is exporting default clock, and you can actually name that whatever you want. But all right, so let's see. I'm gonna npm start this. See what we have. Wait it out, and we should have pretty much nothing that shows up. And that's what we see. We see like this app, but there's nothing in there right now because we didn't actually put anything out of our clock, right? So let's just change that. Instead, let's just return a string. And let's see if that works. All right. So at this point, we know that created a clock component, it's in a separate file, etc. Again, emphasizing to you guys like a few different aspects of development that I don't always talk about in class here. This might be a point in time where if I was doing this, like say at work or something, I may actually right now, oops, I'm gonna make this bigger. That made it go wider too. So if I do get status, you can see that, oh, sure enough, I've modified the source app and I've created a source clock. And I'm saying, all right, this is great. I want to make sure I know my code's working right now, and I want to make sure that I can always go back to this working state. So I might do a get add dots to say add all of my files to the staging area. So if I do get status now, we see it says changes to be committed. Oh, here's all of my files. And now I can do a get, and if I want to do it really fast, I can do -m, initial clock working. And now if I do a get status, there's nothing there. But that also means I can always go back to that state in time inside of get. And that means that I don't have to worry about breaking something that I can't get back to, because using get, I'll be able to get back to this point in time. And if you're more comfortable on using something other than the command line, you don't have to use the command line for get. It's really not a requirement. There's a lot of great GUIs as well. But we're going to build this thing out piece by piece. And I don't want to look at this. I want to look at the React tree here. So the next thing I want to do now, I've got a basic clock. It's returning something, but it's not actually rendering the time at all, right? So maybe I can figure out how to render the time. Well, one way to get the time in JavaScript is you can date from the date object. And this should just be a pretty simple little process in terms of getting ourselves a date, where we do new date. So that should give us the current date. And then what I'm going to do is use a method on that date object, which is to locale time string. And what that's going to do is, if we hover over that, it should give us a hint here, because Visual Studio Code's smart. It says converts a time to a string by using the current or specified locale. So now let's look at what happens here, right? Sure enough, we're rendering, and it even shows the time, 7:42. Yeah, it looks right. But as we had before with our, let me zoom in on this side, not the other side. As we had before, it's not updating at all, right? So how do I get it to update? I just refresh my page, it's going to re-render with the new time. But that's not what I want to do. I want this to be able to update dynamically. Okay, so I know how to get a date, but it's only inside of this render right now. Well, we talked about how to change something internal, and that was, we use state. So we can set state on something. But before we even do that, before I even override the constructor, I'm going to put some tiny overrides for these lifecycle methods so that we can see them. So component did mount. And this actually tells you what properties get passed in. Oh, maybe it doesn't right here. Let me see. Component did mount. No, it's not going to tell me right there, so won't worry too much about it. But they do get the information about like your props or your component. But all I'm going to do right now is just add some logging to my console so that we can see what's going on. So then let's do what did I say? I always get this one wrong, right? I got to go back and look at my references because I feel like the naming of them is a little confusing. So just so you know, it's not like just you who can have that. So let me see what these are, right? Component will unmount and component did update. All right. So I'll go ahead and write hooks for those. Did unmount or will unmount. And I'll finish that in a second. And component did update. All right, so I'm just going to steal these messages and change them as needed. Oops, component unmount or clock unmounted. All right. So let's see what happens here with that, right? Let me pull up the console down here. And if I re-render this, we see clock mounted gets called, but nothing else gets called. Clock mounted is the only lifecycle method that got called in that. Can anybody explain to me why none of the other lifecycle methods got called? I'll go ahead and throw the cheat sheet up here because it might help you pinpoint why out of these 3 life cycle methods that we're looking at, and I didn't put stuff in render or constructor, but this is the only one that got called. So why didn't either of these get called? Yeah, because nothing was updated or unmounted, right? That component is still in the DOM, and we're not updating it because we're not changing any of the props, and we're not changing the state. So without changing one or the other of those, it's not actually going to change. Now let me show you, I'm going to do this in the sort of the hacky way that we did before, going all the way back up to this index.js. If you remember, when we did our first version of some sort of timer or the button, I wrapped all of this inside of some render method, or function. And that was so that, will that work? There we go. That was so that this could get called when something changed. So I'm going to do that same thing again, where we'll do a set interval. And what we're going to do is call render. Oops, I don't need to invoke it right then. That's something that will trip you up. It still trips me up. You just saw me do that, right? It'll be a gotcha is if I call this, or I have a reference to this function, and I don't have the parentheses around it, that means I didn't actually call the function and get back what it returns. It's just a reference to the function that can be used elsewhere. But if I put the parentheses here, it would be a reference not to the function, but to the result of evaluating this function, which in this case would be undefined because I'm not returning anything. So let's try this now, and let's see what happens. Oh, wow, React is even smarter than I thought. I didn't think we would see clock updated, so I'm really shocked at that right now. Because since we're calling React DOM.render each time, I thought it would be mounted again every time and unmounted, or if not, well, maybe not unmounted, but at least mounted again each time. So there's some really interesting stuff going on there that I don't even fully understand, which React is smart enough, apparently, to recognize that, oh, this is already rendered there. So I just got shocked by the behavior that we saw as well. Sort of blows my mind. And we can see that the time is getting updated every second, right? Now let's get rid of that because this isn't the way that we want to do this work. What we want is to go ahead and render the app once, and then the clock component should have its own internal state knowing what time it is, because it's silly to have that stuff outside of the clock. So we're going to go ahead and do that, right? The first thing that we need to do here now is we need to give it some internal state. And that means we need to override the constructor to set this state initially. So we're going to call the superfunc constructor. That's the constructor of react.component directly, because we need to call that. And then we're going to set our state, or a portion of it, and we're going to set a date value on that, just like we were doing down here. And now instead of referencing date that way, it'll be this.state.date. Since it's set in the constructor, let's see if this works. Cannot set, oh, hold on. Cannot set property date of undefined. Oh, yes. So I can't write it this way. I have to write it like this. This.state equals, and then I have to do a new, like an object literal syntax to initialize my state. Like this. That's valid, or should be. So let's see. All right. So now we've moved the state into our component, but once again, it's not updating, right? We've got that same problem that we originally had. So now we have to have it update at some sort of interval. And this is the part where we're going to start using some of these lifecycle methods, because we only want to start the interval for this clock when this component renders. So if, for example, this wasn't on the page the whole time and it gets rendered later, we don't want that interval going the whole time. Plus, that interval is going to need to be able to call, like, whatever happens in that interval is going to need to be able to call this dot state, change our state. So it has to be internal to this. So in order to hook that up, we need to hook it up in one of our lifecycle methods. Now we could do it in the constructor, but it's generally best not to hook up anything other than the very basic bits inside of your constructor. So instead, we're going to go into this component did mount that we already have. And here, we're going to create this interval. So we're going to set our interval. And we're going to say for every second, we want to do something, right? And what do we want to do? I'm just stealing the React documentation for this one. I like the name of it. What we want to do is, and I'll move it down here. It doesn't matter where it's defined. We want to have the clock tick. It's pretty simple. So we're going to reference this dot tick. We need that to update on our intervals. Now, technically, since I'm doing this, I need to do this dot tick dot equals tick dot bind to this. Honestly, I don't think you have to do this anymore, but I'm going to focus on it for now. I think the newer version of Webpack and stuff can manage all that for you, but we'll write it out that way. So now I've got tick. This is going to get called every second, roughly. And what we need to do every second is update our date of our state. So let's see. What's the method that we use to update the state again? What does the 1000 stand for in the set interval? Let's go look at the documentation for a second for set interval. Why is it not showing up here? All right, I'll just look it up here. Set interval. Oh, was it over there? So what it says is the set interval method calls a function or evaluates an expression at specified intervals in milliseconds. So it takes the function to call and then how many milliseconds apart the calls should be. So 1000 is 1000 milliseconds, and as it says here, 1000 milliseconds equals 1 second. So basically, we're setting it so that the interval will fire every second, roughly. It's not guaranteed to do that, but we're not going to get into the details of that right now. So that's what's going on with that set interval. All right, does anybody remember what we call to update the state? That's right. This dot set state, right? And then what we want to do is pass it a new object that it's going to mix into the existing one. And what we want to do is change the date each time. So we'll just create a new date object. And this is a little confusing if you haven't worked with dates in code before, which is that a date object isn't just like the day, it's the date and time and everything else. And so every time that we're creating a new one of these, it's getting that moment in time, that date, that time. So now we've got this lifecycle bit that should be firing. Let's go back and see if this works. Yeah, it looks like we're firing roughly every second. And we can see our clock is being updated. But we've still only mounted once, right? So even though our data is changing, every second, it's re-rendering. And I can emphasize that as well. If we go look, let me shrink this down some. If we look at this clock component, oh, is it not showing us the highlighting anymore? It should be highlighting the updates. But it should be sort of highlighting because that thing is getting updated every time, right? It's not re-rendering, but it's getting updated. I guess they've changed the way that they show that. Weird. And if we look, we can see this date object is changing. So now we've got something that's got updating like this. Let's just show you that it's also calling render every time. Now you should not, this is one of those things I'm doing just for class, you should not have console.logs in your render. But I'm doing that just to show you that every time it updates, it's re-rendering. Every time it updates, it's re-rendering. And you can even see it rendered before the first mount, rendered the clock mounted. Ah, good catch, Mary. Yeah. No, you shouldn't need to import anything for a date. But yeah, it's when you're writing an object literal, it's a mistake I think I make all the time. I put a semicolon at the end, but anything inside of an object literal should not have a semicolon, or it'll be an error. Okay, so now we're rendering. Is somebody at my door? Just a moment. I think there might be somebody at my door. All right, sorry. Your tongue is better than your computer. Yes, Gizmo is a very, very cranky dog. Gizmo, please leave it. Good boy. All right. So we've got our stuff. It's rendering every second, right? We've got this tick happening, which is awesome. And the important thing is by doing this component did mount, where our set interval was, it's not happening before we get this component, right? We wouldn't have even been able to reference this .tick outside of that. But we do have one problem right now, which is if this component, this clock component, ever got unmounted for some reason. So if it wasn't in the DOM, which let me go ahead and set some stuff up so we can do that. You guys will get to see some just a little bit more advanced React bit to show you how that would work. But then this would end up triggering an error because this set interval is still going to be firing. It's still going to try to fire, but it's going to try to not exist anymore because this whole object doesn't exist. So I'm going to go to my app.js. Let me see. What am I going to do here? Here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to create a simple functional component. I'm going to set a bit of some logic out here. How am I going to do this right? Nope. I'm not even going to do it this way. See, I still have the state problem. I need it to re-render. So what I'm going to do is change my app to be a class. So class app extends react.component. Oops. It doesn't have this. This goes inside of a render method. Now I should be okay because I don't have any references to this. So let's see. Refresh. All right, everything's working. Now I'm going to give my app some state as well. And its state is going to be this dot state equals show clock is true. Oops, I'm missing something in my constructor. Anybody see what I'm missing right now? I'll go down and work on some of this other stuff while I talk. Somebody can mention it, but we're missing something that has to exist in every constructor. Then what I'm going to do is render a button that wants to do something on click. And the button's going to say, just hide clock. Yep, exactly. I'm missing the call to super, right? I need to call the constructor of my super class. So I need to have that. So when this clicked, I want it to hide the clock. So I'm going to create something here that'll just be called hide clock. Very simple. And what I want to do is set the state to be show clock false whenever hide clock. And so then the on click here, I'm going to say on click equals hide clock is what I want. Oh, look, it was very nice. This dot hide clock. And again, I'm missing one other thing. This dot hide clock equals this dot hide clock dot bind to this, just sort of that magic string. Are props necessary? I'm sure we went over this, but right now I don't remember. We're not using the button here is getting a prop, this on click property, and I guess this div technically is getting a prop of class name as well. In this particular application right now, but I'll show you, if we keep building on this tonight, I'll show you an example of props and state and how, it all depends on what component you're in and where they live, how they're related to each other at times, because anything you pass into a component needs to be passed in as a prop. That's the only way you pass stuff in, but anything internal to the component is state. All right, so let's see if this works. I don't know if this will work. Oh, I'm missing a bit of logic here right now. I've got all of this stuff. Let me even make sure that this gets called. Hiding the clock. All right, let's see. Oh, sure enough, I have this. Oh, it said hiding the clock, but the clock is still there. It's because I didn't actually hide the clock when I did this. I'm gonna, for the sake of simplicity, and so this isn't on the same line, I'm gonna go ahead and wrap this button in its own div just to put it on the next line as well, because buttons are our inline elements by default. So I need to move that down, but what I'm not doing is deciding whether or not to render this clock. So this is something we haven't talked about, and it wasn't actually necessarily part of this lesson directly, but I think it's really useful, is you can do conditional rendering of components. So we've got this bit of JSX here, but we don't always have to render every portion of it. And since this JSX is, we can nest JavaScript just like we are here using the curly braces. What I'm going to do is something a little interesting, but it does work. and you could do this a little cleaner as well. I'm going to nest it first, and then maybe I'll clean it up in a minute. Is I'll put a bit of logic here that says if this dot state dot show clock, then inside of that, I'm going to have this bit of clock, just this JSX here. I think this will work. It might complain at me. We will see how this goes. Oh, that's right. This all has to be on the same line, I think, for it to work. Let me see if that'll work. It gets uglier when you do that, but let's see. Is that gonna work? No, I may have to do some other work. I may have something else wrong here in terms of nesting this. So let me, instead, I'll pull this out. Let me go back to just my clock here. And what I'm going to do is, before I return, I'm going to put some extra logic in my render up here. And what I'm going to have here is I'm just going to create a variable, which I'm going to clock. And I'm going to, oh, I don't want to do var. Let's do let. And I'll put the little bit of code here that I had. If this dot state dot show clock, then clock equals this clock component. And then right down here, I'm actually just going to render that clock element instead of what I had. And I know it's a little confusing because all I did was change the case from uppercase to lowercase. Again, I'll go over this a little more in just a second because that's really more, hold on. The tag clock, oh, I don't render it this way, that's right. What I need to do here, because it's a JavaScript variable and not a JSX thing, is I need to render it using escape JavaScript. So let me see, that should work. All right, so now we've got our clock up there. Let's see if our clock bucks. It did. But you notice we threw an error. All of that was sort of a side way of getting to this error, right? Is when we hit that clock, we fired the clock unmounted lifecycle method, and then it says can't perform a React state update on an unmounted component. And actually, it's trying that over and over, but it only gave us the error once because this set interval keeps firing every second because we didn't get rid of it at all. So what we need to do, if you remember from our earlier example, we need to call that clear interval. Oh, okay, they are on here. They just use a longer name. So we need to call clear interval with the ID of our interval when we unmount, which means when we create the interval, we need to hold a reference. Now we could put that in the state if we wanted to, but since it's not actually going to affect the rendering of our component, since we don't, like the interval reference isn't affecting that, we can actually just attach it right to our object just using the syntax. So we could call this, you know, just the this dot interval. And then if we have a reference to that, we can delete the interval or clear the interval when we unmount our component. So now if we come back here, we re-render, and we tell it to hide the clock is hidden, but we don't have that bug that we had before, because that's why you need to clean something up sometimes when you unmount a component, right? Oh, this was something that we had to clean up, otherwise we would have a bug, some sort of problem. I know that's a lot. There's a lot going on here in what we've worked through right now. So let me pause for a second before we move on and give people a chance to ask questions about what we have. I can also, let me try and get as much of this as I can. Let me see here. I think that's pretty good. Get as much as I can rendered right there in one screenshot so you can see it. But what do people think about this so far? Any questions, anything that really wasn't clear? Oh, I see Mary Alice's question. That's interesting. What would happen if you put a render, copying all the code from the existing render, but leave out the clock part in the hide clock function? You should never call render directly in a React component, just like you should never update the props. Instead, you should update your state, or if you need to force a render for some reason, what you would do is call force update. And if you put all of the code in the hide clock function that was like the render, you didn't a call to render, then it wouldn't use that. Now you could return some JSX from that if you wanted to. It would be a little weird, a little different. But you could return JSX from that, or you could set some JSX even in your state. Again, not necessarily the most common thing, but it could be done. Yes, unmounting stopped the clock. That's correct. We could also do that a different way, right? Like let's add another button. Let's add another button here that stops our clock. I think this is a great example of one. I hadn't thought of this yet, but I'll basically copy all this stuff. We're going to put another button that's going to stop the clock but not hide it. And actually, before I do that, real fast, just so that I can make this code more robust with the way I like it, I'm going to change this hide clock, and I'm going to toggle clock. And what this is going to do is instead of just setting show clock to whatever to false, I'm going to set show clock to the opposite. So not of this dot state dot show clock. So it's going to change it, toggle it from true to false as we click this button. And I'll just change the name of it to toggle the clock. And let's see if that works. I think it will. Get back to this in a second. Let me read this comment. So render was okay to use in the class component, but you wouldn't put it in the hide clock function because then it's nested. Yeah, you never, you'll never call render yourself. Essentially, you're never going to invoke this dot render. So you would React is the engine that calls it. So what you want to do is basically, it's sort of weird. You don't get a call render yourself. What you can do is force React to somehow call render is sort of what you're doing. And so this dot set state is a way of saying, all right, React, you need to call render at some point to get the new stuff. And there's different ways to force it to call render, but that's one of them. Let's see if this toggle now works. I don't know. All right, our clock is unmounted. Delete it. Let's bring it back. Rendered the clock. Oh, it mounted again. So another interesting thing here is, if you'll notice, it says clock mounted, right? That's because it's not the same component as the previous one. It actually deleted that object when we unmounted it. and then created a new component when we clicked toggle clock again. So we're deleting it and bringing it back. Now that I've got a toggling button, because that's what I'm going to want for stopping the clock, let's add the ability to stop the clock, right? Stop. I'm going to hard code this, and then I'm going to show you another example of some conditional logic in here. Also now, okay, well, now toggle clock is too vague. So I'm going to change this to toggle clock. Oops, I need to select this one too. Toggle clock visibility. Because this one will be toggle clock running, I guess. And what we're going to do here is the same sort of thing. I'm just going to steal back, toggling the clock running state. And this won't be setting show clock. It's going to be setting a value called is clock running, which is true right now. But we're going to change that based off this button being clicked, right? I'll just call it stop right now. So let's see. All right, we've got another button here, which is cool. Oh, cannot read set state of undefined. You notice it told me, let me re-render this whole thing and let's try it again. So it does still error out. So I click stop clock and it blows up. Cannot read property set state of undefined. I forgot to do something with this new event handler that I bound, and it's telling me it doesn't know what sets. This doesn't make sense when it tries to call set state. This doesn't have any meaning. Set state is on nothing. Does anybody notice what I missed doing in this case? Yeah, this is true. I missed my magic line, right? The one I said you have to do for anything that refers to this. So I'm missing this magic line for my new one. I need to bind it. This dot toggle clock running needs to be bound correctly. That's that magic bit I was saying. And because I didn't have that, it didn't know what this was supposed to control. So now this is working just fine. It tells me it's toggling the clock running state, but my clock just keeps running, right? And that's because this state is in my app, the is clock running, but my clock doesn't know anything about it. It doesn't affect what my clock does. So what I need to do in order to make that work is I need to pass that state into my clock. So what I'm going to do is take this value that's part of the state on my app and pass it in as a property on my clock, which I'll just say is running, because the clock doesn't need to say is clock running. So now this is how state and props can interact with each other. Is the state on one component might get passed down to its children as a property, and that's the only way to pass something down into its children like that. So now I'm passing a value into the clock to tell me if it's running. And now I can go into my clock component if I want and start adding some logic that stops it when that value is false. But this is where we're going to start getting into, how do I know that that value changed? What do I do with that? Well, let's go back and look. I'm going to get rid of these, or no, I guess I'll leave this. I do want this. Let me see what I can do here. I don't know if there's much I can do. So, you know what I'm going to do for now is I'm going to get rid of this interval bit, just for a moment, because this I think will be easier to see. Is all right. We've got our clock mounted. It's not being updated. But if I click stop clock, it tells us we're toggling the clock running state, and then it calls that rendered the clock and clock updated, right? And it's going to call that each time. So that's telling us that every time I click that button, component did mount is being called. If we go back and look at that lifecycle cheat sheet that we have, that's because it got new props. New props calls render, and then component did update. So what we're going to want to do, this is going to get sort of complicated, because with the button outside, if you notice the order here, render gets called, then component did update. So there's going to be some complications. It's not going to be as straightforward as I wanted, because I'm sort of doing this bit on the fly. But component did update is actually it actually takes parameters. We're just not using them right now, which is the previous prop value and the previous state of your component. So we can just call those that, previous props and previous state. Now, we don't need the previous state right now, at least, but previous props are useful. Because we also have this dot props. So now we could compare and say, maybe we don't even need previous props, at least not right now. So let's just refer to our props, right? Let's just console log what's changed as well. I'm going to add this in. This dot props dot is running. So I just want to log that whenever we click this. And what we should see is it toggling from false to true, right? That's great. And now we could bring this back if we want. Let's go ahead and bring our intervals back. Yeah, it's going to get a little spammy. Maybe I'll slow them down so this clock only ticks every 3 seconds. But what we'll see is running is going to be true. I'll let it render, and then if I click this, it changed over real fast. But the problem is, how can this change my interval, right? Like, should I show this new time? What's going on here? Well, here's an important aspect. This gets into something very specific to React, is you should not do anything in your render method that changes the behavior of your component. This should, given the same props, the render method should always put your component in the same state as in before, essentially, right? So I could put some logic in here around this is stopped bit, but I don't want to do that because that would mean that it would be changing some logic around my component. Don't worry too much about what I'm going to do here. This is a little bit like getting convoluted. I'm going to create an infinite loop, probably at first, sort of showing you. But the problem is, since component did update gets called after render gets called, we're not able to, because what we could do here is stop this interval. We could say if, actually this will work. Look, I made this all complicated, and it's going to work because it'll stop us from rendering again because we stopped the interval, right? So if this dot props dot is running, if not this dot props dot is running, which means it's false, right? Then what we want to do is clear our interval, quit counting, quit incrementing. So now if we do this, let me go back to 1 second timer so that we've got something appropriate here. Go back here, we're getting updated every second. And if I click stop clock, it quits updating. And we quit seeing events firing here because we stopped it, nothing's changing the state anymore. Now if I toggle the clock, right, I deleted that clock, that one doesn't exist anymore. I click this, it's a new clock, it's got a whole new interval on it. Or it should. Let me re-render this whole page. Let's see if I have something else wrong. No. Wow, it must actually even be reusing the clock in that case, which I didn't think it would do. No, I think I'd accidentally click stop clock as well. There we go. And if I stop it, it stops, right? But I can't restart it right now, because if I do that, it's not actually going to restart. So now I have to get into some complex logic, because I don't want to just be able to stop. I want this to toggle the state of my clock. So I can say else if this dot props dot is running, then I want to set my interval again, the same way I had before. Except one problem with this bit of code is we're going to be generating a lot of interval bits. Because we're creating a new interval every time, and we're going to get these errors again because we're creating a new interval every time. But most of the time this component did update gets called, the clock is already running. So what we want to do is we only want to set this interval if we went from a previous state of is false to is running true. So now we need to get this previous props value and use that. So we need to say if this dot props dot is running and previous props dot is running is false, so not this dot previous props dot is running. Now I think this should work. So let's see. I'm going to stop my clock. All right. Start it again. Looks like it worked. Stop it. Start it. Toggle it away. All right. So this was a lot, right? I covered a lot of different stuff. We're really starting to build a much more complex application here than we've had in any of the previous classes. We're starting to put some extra logic into our components that lets us do some pretty crazy things, some really powerful stuff. And we're starting to use these lifecycle methods to be able to do these components in a way that lets us hook into other bits of the DOM without worrying about breaking stuff as well. So I mean, probably pretty overwhelming for some of you. Let me know if it was just way too much for everyone, or if some of you feel like you really picked up a fair bit of this. Also, let me know about that, because the more that I get feedback on that, the more I'll know just how to improve in the future, or I can even help try and create like shorter videos explaining some of these concepts as well. But there's a lot going on in this application, a lot more than what we were doing before. Let me give just a minute if anybody has any questions before we get going tonight. Let me know. Otherwise, we'll probably call it a night at this, because we already did a ton and I don't want to try and throw anything else at you. No, I'll message that as well. I didn't get confirmation from Daisy that she got somebody to let people in and to be in the class, so it's going to be just purely virtual, remote Thursday. If people want to get together, like at the American Underground, just in the lobby area there or something, and work together, or you want to get together somewhere else, feel free. But we're not going to have a sit down, in a classroom on Thursday or Saturday either. Oh, you want Gizmo to teach next Tuesday? You guys don't want to see Gizmo. He's cranky. You can see. Let me see if I can get them up here for a minute. I'll see if I can get them on video. Come here, boys. Buddy, Gizmo, come here. Come on, boys. All right, come here. Let's see if I can get you on video. Come here. You are a cranky man. This is the cranky person you guys keep hearing. Yes, he's so angry. Oh, he's so glad he doesn't see you right now. He would be yelling at you so much. Come here, bud. Come on. And this guy is like the sweetest dog in the world. They're like yin and yang. Buddy is just a total sweetheart and will let you pretty much do anything to him. The vet calls him like a perfect, patient, because flips him over to take an x-ray or something, and he just lays there like, all right, just tell me what to do. Right now they're mad at me because they need to go for a walk. So, all right, then I'll see you guys. Well, I guess I'll talk to you guys next Tuesday, and I won't see you before then. So hope you have a good time in between then, and I'll get some stuff out for you guys to work on as well in the meantime. All right, talk to you later.